I want to really thank two phenomenal women who, in my opinion, are just incredible bellwether leaders. We're very privileged to call them our friends. Maeve Campbell is a phenomenal independent climate journalist who works across the UK and increasingly in other parts of the world. And she's just been a real shining star in that regard, bringing new narratives to new audiences. And Maria Netto is the CEO of IX, which is I'm going to pronounce it in my terrible Portuguese, Instituto Climat e Sociedade. And for those who may not be aware, this organization that Maria leads is incredibly influential in Brazil and in the international fora from a philanthropy point of view, and also from a pure scale of change and enabling so much that's happening right now and over the next couple of weeks. So thank you for sharing your time with us, Maeve and Maria. Please take the stage.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to meet you. I'm very glad that we're doing this in English so I don't have to pretend that I speak Portuguese. I would love to speak it, but unfortunately, I'm not there yet. So as Sharon said, my name's Maeve. I'm a climate journalist based in London. And I'm really pleased to be here today to be hosting day 2 of Nature at Climate House with Bellwethers. Yesterday, we had a lot of panels, we had a lot of discussions, but today it's going to be all about the one-on-one, real deep dives with very important people, such as Maria. So as you heard, Maria Netto is Executive Director of Instituto Clima e Sociedade in Brazil, which is a leading philanthropic institution that works to advance the climate agenda in Brazil. With over 30 years in the climate field, Maria is a recognized expert in sustainable finance. She's worked at the UNFCCC, the New Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and has spearheaded many initiatives over the years. So Maria, we're here the week of COP, a really, really important time. 10 years after the Paris Agreement was adopted, we're at another inflection point on the climate agenda. Why does COP30 matter this year in this very fractured world?
Thank you for having me here, Bill Withers, but also maybe it's great to be sitting here with you, and bom dia para todo mundo. The 10 years after Paris is a very important momentum for us to know how far did we go with the targets we set 10 years ago. This week, we had an important report that came out, which is the off the target report on the gap of the greenhouse gases emissions reductions analysis of the United Nations. This report is very important because it shows us that we unfortunately are not under the target we took 10 years ago, but it also says something important, that is, we are much better off than if we would not have taken this target and done something. So there is a part of it which is to say we are not doing that well, but actually having had this target was important because a lot of things happened since then. This COP is a very particular COP, I think, in many ways. First of all, after many, many years, and we have to say the COP started in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992. There was a lot of regulation. There was a lot of things that were created towards the time on what we need to do for the climate agenda to move, and actually nature as well. But now we are at a point where, let's say, the targets are there. We detailed these targets at the last 2 COPs in Dubai and Baku. And we are in a moment that is an inflection. We need to now talk really about implementation. This requires a rethinking a bit maybe of the multilateral process and how the UN system will continue towards the future. So I think this is an important point for this COP. It's not anymore just about more targets, more wishing, more things. It's about, with what all we did in our rule book, how now we really get on target. No? So I think it's the COP of implementation. The second thing is relating to implementation. Because it's about implementation, The action agenda, which is the agenda that is outside the negotiating room, and the concept of mutirão that our presidency presented becomes very important because you can't implement just with governments. Governments are very important for the implementation signals and the long-term policies, but we need to bring the private sector, the civil society to the table. So I think this is the other important thing. Obviously, it's a tough COP because we would have loved to be very specific about the implementation roadmap, and having some important countries like US out of the table clearly do not help the process. And in addition to that, frankly, with wars and a lot of conflicts and issues, we have problems also on commitments and trust among countries.
And so when you say implementation, you mean action. We've got to the point where we've been setting the targets, we've been having the discussions, we've been having the multilateral frameworks. But what are we actually going to do now? And with the US, I know the US doesn't formally leave the Paris Agreement actually till January, but Trump has said that he's not going to send delegates next week to Belém. What do you think? What is the political will? What will be the outcome without America next week?
I think the outcome is going to be, I mean, this year, for example, I was in the Finance for Development event conference in Sevilla, and it was actually a very positive conference at the end. And US was also supposed to be there, in the end was not. So I think in terms of multilateralism, the big thing for Brazil is precisely to create this trust and agree that we need to move ahead. The ambition maybe level is not going to be what we would have expected, clearly without US, but not only about that. The fact that we are having these geopolitical tensions, for example, budgets, a lot of countries that should be leading, particularly for the more developed world, are using budgets now for weapons, for other kinds of purposes. But that said, I think I'm quite positive that we will be able to come out of the COP with a good willingness or moving ahead. And that's the real outcome of this COP, is to demonstrate we can go ahead with multilateralism. The fact that yesterday, the Tropical Forest Forever facility that Brazil put together, which is not a formal thing in the convention, see, this is an action agenda, got actually $3 billion from Norway, $1 billion from Indonesia. This shows that we have even maybe a new configuration coming up of countries that are leading. And maybe, these are the kinds of initiatives that keep us going.
It's great to hear some positivity amid all the geopolitical tension going into next week. And when it comes to kind of breakthroughs, what do you think we should be watching for next week, both in terms of the bioeconomy, in terms of renewables, innovations and breakthroughs that you'd like to recommend?
I think a couple of breakthroughs. First of all, this week here, at the beginning of the week, we started in Rio with the local leaders meeting. There were 2,000 local leaders, cities and governors in Rio, and an amazing commitment of different cities. Bogota City won in the prize of the Earthshot of clean air. London was also doing a lot of innovation. And in Brazil, we have a couple of innovations. So it was very exciting to see that maybe sometimes the federal governments are complicated, but when it comes to more local, it may be more easy also to do the change. So that's, I think, is an important thing. The second is the COP is a COP in the Amazon. So I think TFFF keeps a legacy for the Amazon, but it brings an important point that over the last COPs was a kind of a bit not so considered. According to the science body of the UNFCCC, IPCC, 30% of the emissions reductions we need to do are with nature-based solutions. And we have been leaving this a bit outside of the table. This is a COP where this is in, and is in by the action. For instance, Brazil in the G20 last year was able to lead the adoption for the first time of the concept of bioeconomy. And the concept of bioeconomy includes from the territorial knowledge, the local knowledge, to the technology and the innovation and the opportunities also in terms of scale. This opens a whole opportunity for start talking also on how nature can be part of the solution on climate, the restoration of degraded lands. They can be adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity and combat diversification. So there's a number of initiatives like that that I think are going to come through. Another important breakthrough is the recognition of adaptation, because unfortunately, as we are off the target, we need to consider that a lot of us and the most vulnerable among us even more, have a huge cost, economic cost, of if we are not resilient of the impact of climate change. Here in Brazil last year, we lost billions in the south of Brazil because of inundation and billions because of dry seasons in the Amazon, in Cerrado, in our agriculture. And because we were not prepared, the cost of inaction was much higher than if we were prepared. So the recognition of adaptation is becoming more important also in the convention, and that is relevant because the most vulnerable are unfortunately those who are poorer and most vulnerabilized.
And it's great that you talk about adaptation because I've heard some people pit mitigation against adaptation, which is never helpful, saying, which should we be focusing on most when actually they're both equally important. Adaptation, you might call it resilience, you might call it, community cohesion amid all the impacts. What do you think is most important in Brazil in terms of adaptation measures? What should we be focusing on?
I think there is different opportunities in Brazil, and you are completely right. There is no such a thing of adaptation or mitigation being more important, and actually, a lot of things can be both. So, for example, when we talk about adaptation in cities, nature-based solutions can be a very important way to reduce the heat waves, to improve the way we can have drainage of water, but they also remove greenhouse gases. So there are opportunities to have activities that are both mitigation and adaptation. Certainly in Brazil, our land use and agricultural system need to be adapted, and we need to be able to specify and be very clear about what is good agriculture that is adaptative and promote these kind of initiatives to even reduce the costs of even public money that needs to be paid every time there is a loss. But infrastructure is also very important because there is a lot of territories and particularly communities that are living in areas that are less privileged. And obviously, they are much more vulnerable, for example, with heat waves, right? So if you are in Rio de Janeiro, where I live, in a very nice neighborhood and air conditioning, you don't suffer the heat wave as the people that are in the communities. So that is another understanding that we need to have on infrastructure, how we rebuild our infrastructure. But again, this can be a rebuilding that can also improve the quality of people and lives, but reduce also the budget of cities, ironically, because it will reduce, for example, the cost of health systems.
Everything's so interconnected.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Are you hopeful for the outcome of COP when it comes to fossil fuels, when it comes to language from phase down to phase out?
I think this is a difficult conversation currently because clearly and frankly, if you look at countries that were and are supposed to be more proactive, like Canada, McCartney, Brazil, we're all drilling, right? So let's take this with honesty. We are drilling. We are going to increase production of oil and gas. So Australia, if we have the next COP, is also actually net exporter of oil and gas. So I'm not talking, see, about the Middle East only. We are actually, a lot of those countries are becoming a net exporters. So the challenge with oil and gas is in the current situation, in particular with the pressure of US, drill, baby, drill, and so on, there is a output and a demand that increases, and we depend a lot on oil and gas for royalties and our budget for health, education, and these kind of things. So a proper conversation is needed also on how we reduce also government's dependency of the royalties and what are the alternatives. So I think it's going to be difficult to have something that will go beyond what we have already agreed, frankly, for everything. I think what we had as targets, as I mentioned already, in Dubai and in Baku, these are the targets. The question is, can we have an honest implementation process that unpack what we understand by phasing out fossil fuel? That's maybe possible to have a proper conversation. Part of it also links to the just transition. That's maybe not as much a problem to Brazil, but there are countries in Africa, India, that rely still on certain fossil fuels. And the issue is not about just the fossil fuel, but is the populations, the workers, people who depend on these industries, and the transition is not that simple. So that conversation needs to be properly unpacked, and we need to have some kind of honesty about how easy it is. And I think if the implementation can recognize a space for this dialogue would be very good.
I totally agree on the honesty and not just scapegoating the Middle East as the only ones drilling, because there's plenty more that we are working with. And just because of who we are and where we are in the room, we've got a lot of experts. What would you say that the finance and the private sector can do in a very tangible way to move forward more quickly next week and really accelerate the conversations that need to be had?
I think we are seeing this already, like in these kind of events. And tomorrow we're going to have the Climate Implementation Summit as well. There'll be a lot of pledges. I just want to give one example in Brazil. Last year in the G20, a couple of private sector investors, so BTG Pactual, which is a big fund here in Brazil, Suzano is a big corporate and pulp and paper, the Development Bank of Brazil, Banco do Brasil, and other asset managers, and philanthropies like us, and Conservation International and TNC, we all together created a coalition for bioeconomy and restoration in Brazil. And the coalition had two big targets, $10 billion dollars by 2030 for bioeconomy and restoration in scale in Brazil, and $500 million for indigenous and local communities. It is amazing to see that now we have already 4.2 billion that is going to be announced tomorrow. And these are things that the companies and the funds are doing, maybe with less of this kind of stringency that it has to be like this and that. But when together you have some kinds of targets that are acceptable and everyone can put a little bit of their side, as a whole, we can have a lot of advancements. And with indigenous peoples, there is an ongoing conversation on how to support funds, because Brazil has some initial indigenous funds that are being developed by themselves, how we can support these funds to access finance as well. So I think these are things that if you develop in this kind of inclusive way, but also in an organic way, sometimes can be very interesting. So I think we have quite a few of these things coming. Are they going to be changing everything? Probably not, because we need to keep this happening. But for me, this is a very important message of the COP. Beyond what is being negotiated in the room, what we are seeing is the cities, as I mentioned, is the funds, is the business, is civil society doing things.
Yeah. Many layers to the eventual outcome. Well, thank you so much, Maria. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time, so thank you very much. And I'm going to now welcome Val, Flor, and Sharon to the stage to discuss the groups that are coming up. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. So thank you for setting up the stakes, Maria. And I know you have to run to your next engagement. So thank you for sharing some of your time on a very, very busy day. And thank you, Maeve. That was there's a lot to cover, and that was really well done in a short space of time. So I guess I'm really here to set out a little bit about bellwethers, why we exist, why we've turned up in Latin America, and Val will then come and talk a bit more about the structure of today. So a couple of years ago, really during the lockdown, during the time of everyone wasn't working or working from home due to COVID, I did a lot of long walking meetings, and this went on for years with Bernice Lee, who sat over there on her phone, and is in pink, and is our board chair, and we decided that there was a really big question that really needed answering, and the question was one of leadership. If we have a blueprint in the Paris Agreement, what it requires is thousands and thousands of people to help us launch a new economy. And to launch a new economy is not possible without thousands of leaders in every sector and every institution knowing what to do and feeling confident in their agency. So we really set up bellwethers to try and answer that question. How do we engage leaders everywhere, across business, finance, everywhere, to integrate nature and climate challenges into their everyday decision making? And so because transitions of any kind are incredibly hard and very bumpy, there's no straight road. You know, we heard that from Maria right now. It's not a direct route all the time. So how do we create this sort of new kind of Overton window for a massive global cultural shift, particularly in a fragmented world like ours? And so we decided the only way to do that is to reach people where they are. So Bellwethers is, Nature and Climate House is one of our programs, and it is really like a bit of acupuncture. It's how do we like put a pin in, attract some leaders, and start these conversations. That's the goal. So we first launched Nature and Climate House at South by Southwest in London in June. We're only an 18-month-old organization. And we'll be sort of partnering South by Southwest across the world now. But we also knew that our second edition had to be in Latin America, because one of the key things we've heard this morning is how the world needs to adapt as well as cut emissions. And we have to do it all at the same time with the same set of resources, because there's not going to be multiple sequential pots of money. So if adaptation is the issue, then understanding the value of a bioeconomy is the solution frame. And that understanding can only be born in this region. And it already is. 50 countries have bioeconomy strategies. It was first defined at the G20 in Brazil last year. So we are here to say, how can we engage all of you? If you're in this room, you've been invited. And if you're in this room, you are already a leader and you have agency. Our role is to say, how can we help? And how can we help shape your sense of commitment and cooperation in this regard? So we are thrilled to sort of welcome you, to have you here. We feel very privileged to have your invaluable time. We hope this morning will be really fulfilling and interesting for you as well. And so without further ado, I want to hand over to a fabulous partner who's helping us build our initiatives in Brazil, Val Flor.
Obrigada, Cheryl. Agora vamos falar em português aqui, hein? Podemos. Obrigada, pessoal. Bom dia para todos vocês. Estou muito feliz de estar aqui com vocês. A gente está preparando esse Nature and Climate House Summit de São Paulo há alguns meses, e ver vocês todos aqui hoje, cada um de vocês, é muito emocionante, muito gratificante para a gente. Ao longo do dia, a gente vai receber mais de 100 lideranças que vão participar das mesas redondas, mas o que importa para a gente não é o número, mas é a potência que cada um de vocês, como a Cheryl já trouxe também, é a atuação que vocês já fazem, e a gente quer aqui convidar vocês mais uma vez para ousar agir, ousar construir de forma colaborativa, tá bom? Então, muito, muito obrigada pela presença de vocês. Vamos passar um pouquinho aqui da agenda, que eu acho que está todo mundo curioso, né? Um formato diferente, as roundtables. Vou passar aqui com vocês o que vai acontecer a partir de agora. Vou falar mais 2 minutinhos, prometo, e aí a gente já vai passar aqui para as mesas redondas, que eu vou explicar um pouquinho como é que funciona. A gente tem mesas, literalmente mesas espalhadas aqui pelo AIA nesse andar. A gente tem 90 minutos de mesa, né? Cada mesa tem uma liderança, e a gente tem até 10, às vezes 11 pessoas em cada uma dessas mesas, tá? Depois, quando vocês terminarem essas mesas, vocês voltam para cá, na plenária, só para a gente fazer um fechamento, tá? São meia horinha aqui, só para a gente entender os principais destaques de vocês nessas conversas que vocês tiveram. E aí, quem puder ficar com a gente aqui, a gente vai servir um brunch, um almoço leve aqui, e aí a gente termina o dia de hoje, na parte da manhã com vocês, mas vocês são super convidados para o nosso happy hour. Temos um happy hour hoje à tarde, quando a gente terminar as mesas redondas da tarde, a gente vai ter aqui um coquetel, vai ter alguns drinks. Espero receber vocês novamente aqui, espero que vocês possam voltar, tá bom? Falar um pouquinho também das mesas redondas de hoje. Então, a gente, agora, na parte da manhã, temos 4, e vocês devem estar identificados aqui com uma etiquetinha né? Uma bolinha colorida, isso significa qual é a cor da sua mesa também, fica fácil da gente identificar por aqui. Então, a gente tem a mesa verde, que é a Monique Vani. Cadê a Monique? Está aqui já? Está ali fora? Monique, depois se ela puder vir aqui para a gente, quem não conhecer a Monique, tem algumas pessoas da mesa que talvez não a conheçam, e ela vai falar sobre soluções baseadas na natureza para territórios e clima junto com seus convidados, tá? Que Vani, boa, essa é a Vani, para quem estiver na mesa dela. A gente tem a mesa do Almir, o Almir está aqui identificado, né? Mas dá um oi aí para a galera, né, Almir? Almir Suruí, do povo Paté Suruí, lá de Rondônia, veio aqui para a gente. Volta para mim uma. E a mesa dele é a sabedoria ancestral e as economias da sabedoria ancestral às economias do futuro, o conhecimento indígena e as soluções impulsionadas pela natureza. A gente tem depois a terceira mesa com o Ricardo Moraes. Cadê o Ricardo? Está aqui, para quem não conhece, para quem vai estar na mesa dele, Ricardo. EIA, inteligência artificial gerando valor positivo, unindo pesquisa, tecnologia e investimento para soluções escaláveis. E a gente tem a quarta mesa, a mesa do Ricardo Azul, né? E a mesa do André Aquino. Cadê o André? Ah, está aqui. André Aquino também, que vai falar sobre laboratórios urbanos para um futuro regenerativo. É a mesa vermelha, tá bom? Pode passar. E aí tem uma regra aqui que a gente vai usar, que eu não sei se todo mundo é familiarizado, mas é a regra do Chatham House. Então, o que significa? As pessoas que estiverem participando dessas mesas, elas são livres para depois compartilharem esse conteúdo. A única coisa que a gente vai pedir é que vocês não identifiquem quem disse aquela frase, aquela sentença, ou de qual partido ou de qual filiação ela é. Tá? Essa é uma regra que é muito comum ser utilizada em mesas multilaterais, né? Mesas que estão ali garantindo uma conversa mais segura, um diálogo mais aberto para a gente poder conversar. Tá bom? Essa é a única regra. Vocês podem compartilhar qualquer coisa, dá uma olhadinha lá no chathamhouse.org, que é um site que tem mais detalhes sobre essas regras. Bom, material de apoio também, várias pessoas perguntando sobre isso. A gente vai ter as mesas, cada uma tem uma liderança. Essa liderança ela foi mais brifada por nós aqui do que ela pode fazer, como que ela vai conduzir essa conversa. A gente preparou um guia, mas cada um tem total liberdade para também seguir da sua forma. Tá? A gente não impôs nada, foi só um guia mesmo. E tem um mapa também em cada uma dessas mesas para sistematização, para registrar. A gente deixou no papel mesmo, que acho que é gostoso ficar ali, né, escrevendo. Tem um post-it também, tem canetas para todo mundo. A gente tem algumas perguntas norteadoras que vão dirigir essa mesa e vocês fiquem à vontade para finalizar em 90 minutos. Cada uma das mesas também tem um laptop que está fazendo a transcrição com AI. Tá? Então, a gente provavelmente não coleta tudo, mas a gente coleta alguma coisa que vai ser útil para a gente depois na sistematização dessas conversas, para a gente reportar isso e fazer essa parte da rede internacional. Vocês viram que algumas mesas têm umas bandeirinhas que a gente colocou, né? Português e inglês. Então, tem aqui 3 mesas que vão ser bilíngues. Se você está numa dessas mesas, não se preocupe com o seu idioma. Você vai falar o seu idioma nativo, com exceção de quem é chileno, ou se a gente tem colombiano e argentinos por aqui, né, a gente dá só com português e inglês. Mas eu sei que todo mundo que está aqui, né, que é da América Latina, que não é do Brasil, fala português, então vai poder entender também. Então, essas mesas, elas vão ter os fones, um headset, né, um fone e microfone. Então, o que a gente vai pedir para vocês? Todo mundo precisa colocar. Tá? Então, mesmo se você fala bem inglês, ou se fala bem português, por favor, usem o microfone, né, e o headset, porque aí a tradução vai conseguir fazer ali para a pessoa que não fala a língua da mesa. Tá? Tudo bem até aqui? Isso vai facilitar, porque a gente vai ter que falar um por vez. Não é difícil numa mesa? Imagina, né? Um por vez. Não é fácil, mas isso vai fazer com que a tradução possa fazer a transcrição correta. Tá bom? Além disso, a gente tem a nossa equipe de apoio aqui, tem a Carol, tem o Rafa, tem a Tereza, a maioria de vocês conversou com eles por WhatsApp, por e-mail, a nossa equipe maravilhosa de produção também que está aqui para ajudar. E do time da Bioeconomy tem a Sara. Cadê a Sara? Está aqui? Sara está aqui, olha. Sara também vai falar, apoiar também vocês. A Sara não fala português, está quase lá, né, Sara? Mas ainda não vai atender mais o pessoal que está falando inglês, tá bom? Bom, gente, é isso. O pessoal vai conduzir vocês para as mesas. ousem construir, ousem agir de forma colaborativa. Obrigada.